Hey guys, welcome to our very first discussion board assignment. So the way this discussion board works is every week I'll meet you here at the discussion board. We'll do a quick walkthrough of some of the key points in our reading that I want to highlight, and then we'll jump into the discussion board question. And so Monday through Wednesday, you'll watch the video and post your initial discussion board response. Each of these videos will, at the very end, have a number of questions that you can use to kind of guide your initial discussion board post. And then the second half of the week, Thursday through Sunday, you'll come back to the discussion board and respond to some of your peers' posts. So be sure to check back a couple times each week, since this is an interpersonal conflict resolution course. Student engagement, instructor engagement, actually talking about these tools and principles on the discussion board is so important. So with that said, let's dive in and get started. So in Matthew 5:9, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." And the reason I bring this passage up again is because it's important to remember that it's one thing to want to be a peacemaker. It's another thing to actually bring peace to a high conflict situation. And that's what we're going to dive into this week. We're going to look at some do's and do nots for being a peacemaker, some tools that work, and some tools that can take an already messy situation and increase the chaos, which of course is something that we don't want to do. So the inspiration for this next slide comes from the greatest commandment. If you remember, one day Jesus was approached by a man who asked him, "What is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus replied, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second greatest commandment is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And so right at the top, it says it takes wisdom to love others well. And kind of the idea for this comment comes from a story I heard a pastor tell a number of years ago. He talked about how initially when he and his wife were married, he had this grandiose idea about how he was going to impress his wife on Valentine's Day. He said, "What I was going to do is cook her this fantastic meal, prepare the house while she was away at work. I was going to set the table, put on a tablecloth, bring out the nice china, light a candle, and then I was going to take rose petals and have these rose petals, kind of have a rose petal path going from the door to the kitchen table to the living room where we're going to go next and watch a movie, all the way over to the bedroom." And he said, "I almost put my plan into action, and then I realized, wait a minute, my wife's going to come in, she's going to look at these rose petals, and she's not going to think they're romantic. Her first thought is going to be, I wonder who's going to clean that up." And so he said, I had to learn how to love my wife in a way that was meaningful to her. And I think this is relevant for our conflict resolution class, because really in working with people, we're learning how to love people in a way that works best for them. It's one thing to want to live out the greatest commandments. It's one thing to want to love our neighbor as ourselves. It's another thing to love people well, especially people in a high conflict situation. Life is messy, and there's a lot of factors that can contribute to high conflict. And so in this course, in this initial session, we're going to look at tools that can contribute to loving other people well and tools that can be a hindrance to loving other people well. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. So a foundational skill in resolving conflict, in working with people who are in a high conflict situation, is empathy. There's an old quote that says, "Hurt people hurt people." And I love this quote from our book, People Skills. It says, "Many people are victims of victims." And I like this quote because it's a good quote to keep in mind in developing empathy. I know when I worked in the domestic violence offenders program, a lot of the guys and the women that I worked with had been victims of domestic violence themselves. And so instead of seeing this group of guys as somebody who had done something horrible and awful and terrible, it helped me to look at them and to realize that a lot of the guys in the group didn't know any better. So instead of crossing my arms and being judgmental and looking down at my nose, nose at them, I realized many of these guys were in the same place that probably you and I would be had we grown up in a similar situation. So for a lot of these guys, they grew up in households where mom and dad were arguing all the time, where when somebody was angry, things around the house were being broken or thrown. Maybe they grew up with a dad who, when he got angry, would turn around and punch a hole in the wall. Or some of these guys had seen their mom be violent towards their dad, or their dad be violent towards their mom. And so when I led this group, I would look at these guys and see not just a group of violent, angry people, but a group of men and women who didn't know any better. And I would suggest that the good news was they could change this ongoing cycle. It didn't have to pass down to their kids. They could, in the group, make the declaration, this ends with me. And so, keeping in mind that many people in high conflict situations are victims of victims is one way to develop that empathy. So next, let's look at some common communication barriers. And these are on page 16 of Communication Skills, if you want to follow along as we look through them. So the first one on the list is criticizing. And this one was identified by marriage researcher John Gottman as one of the 4 contributing factors that would make it highly unlikely that a relationship would not work out. So John Gottman's well known for being able to predict with about 90% accuracy in a very short period of time which couples are going to make it and which couples are not. Criticism, he says, is so deadly that he refers to it as one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So criticizing is different than simply expressing frustration. Criticism says there's something fundamentally wrong with you. It says you're the problem. You're a slob. You can't do anything right. You always, you never. So it really says at your core, there's something fundamentally wrong with you. Those would be examples of criticism. Next on John Gottman's list of the 4 horsemen is something he calls contempt. And contempt is often, can be verbal, and a lot of times it's nonverbal as well. So I'm bringing up contempt because name calling is definitely a form of contempt, along with eye rolling, maybe giving somebody a dirty look. And again, contempt communicates you're the problem, there's something wrong with you. Diagnosing is on the list, and of course that's going to be a barrier to conflict resolution. Of course, diagnosing is something that often needs to be done in a clinical setting, but in a non-counseling setting, diagnosing is going to hinder conflict resolution. Because again, it doesn't encourage 2 people to come together to resolve an issue. Instead, it says, there's something wrong with you. You're mentally ill. You're the problem. Not how can the 2 of us work together to bring resolution to this problem. It's interesting to see that praising evaluatively is on the list, but it's important to remember that praise can be done in a good, appropriate, encouraging way. It can also be done in a manipulative way. In fact, if you think back over your own life, you can probably think of a time when somebody piled on the praise, but they didn't do it in a sincere, encouraging way. It was really done to manipulate you or to try to get what they wanted. Similarly, on the list are things like ordering, threatening, moralizing. This is a big one that I see in the teenagers that I work with. You know, a lot of them have had so many lectures and moralizing done towards them. I see as soon as an adult start talking, their eyes begin to glaze over. The look on their face kind of says it all. It says, I'm here physically, but mentally I'm miles and miles away. So that's something that's just important to be aware of, especially in working with teenagers. Often just by the look they give, they'll indicate there's a barrier here. Physically, my body's in the room, but mentally I'm completely checked out. Excessive, inappropriate questioning, advising, diverting, logical argument can certainly be overused, or it can be used in a way that says, I'm logically right, therefore you have to do what I'm telling you to do. And then even reassuring can be used in a condescending or a manipulative way. So it's important to know that these are some barriers to communication. There are some barriers to good conflict resolution. And you'll read more about those in the People Skills book. So next, let's look at some good conversational essentials. So here's 5 skills that are essential in good conversation, especially in conflict resolution. So the first one says to be warm. And there's a reason that I showed the picture. You can see in the picture below of the guy and girl talking, it's a warm conversation. A lot of times these warm skills or engaging skills are referred to as micro skills. Things like having good, steady eye contact, not laser intensity, but warm, friendly contact where you're looking in the other person's eyes, you're non-verbally communicating, you're important, I'm interested in you. You can see their bodies are turned towards one another, they're smiling. Number 2, be in conversation, not a lecture. And this is absolutely huge in creating change. It's something that therapists are learning how to do. There's one type of therapy called motivational interviewing. It's used a lot in addiction recovery, and it felt really weird when I first started using it. Because the whole idea with motivational interviewing isn't to come in and lecture. It's not to say you're wrong, but it's to approach the situation with curiosity. And so a good motivational interviewer will look at somebody who's using drugs and they'll say, hey, tell me why you use. Tell me what you like about drugs. What do you like about smoking marijuana? Okay, well, what else do you like about it? Okay, that's interesting. Tell me more. You like the way it makes you feel. How does it make you feel? Tell me more about that. And then really after asking all of these questions, they'll then begin to steer the conversation in a different direction. And they'll say, well, is there anything you don't like about it? Now, the interesting thing about motivational interviewing are 2 things. First of all, as a therapist, it was really uncomfortable sitting and listening to a teenager tell me why they liked using drugs and encouraging this conversation. Second thing I saw is, boy, does this work. When I came back with the question of, well, is there anything you don't like about it? These kids are usually willing and ready to engage. And so being in a conversation, not a lecture, makes such a huge difference. That kind of goes along with number 3, connect even with differences. Change can be hard. Chances are it took people a long, long time to learn some of the negative patterns that developed in their lives. So they're not going to change overnight. So communicating even with differences is so important. Here at Southern California Seminary, I had an excellent supervisor help me learn how to do this. I remember some of the first counseling sessions that I was in. I was very passionate, very excited, wanted to move things along so quickly. And this supervisor was able to use sarcasm in just a great way. I still to this day remember him looking at me, kind of smiling and saying, so Jed, you should probably have this problem fixed in next 2 or 3 sessions, right? And I looked at him and kind of said, I'm going too fast, aren't I? I'm pushing forward too hard. And he said, yep. So a lot of times bad habits take a long time to develop, and it's okay for people to take a long time to unlearn them. There's an old saying that says, slow to learn, slow to forget. So connect even with differences. Remember, change is a process. We don't have to resolve everything right now. Number 4 says discomfort versus injury. Good conversational essentials say it's okay to be uncomfortable. This is something that I talked about when we looked at being in a conversation, not in a lecture. For me, using motivational interviewing skills, it feels discomforting. It makes me feel uneasy. And something that I'm learning how to do is to sit and be okay with my own uneasiness. So discomfort doesn't mean injury. Just because somebody feels bad or the conversation doesn't feel good doesn't mean that a personal attack's happening. So learn to separate discomfort from injury. And then, of course, number 5, observe yourself. And that one's so important. Just kind of being aware of your own emotions, being aware of your own feelings, being aware of how you're coming across, which may not be how you're intending to come across. So good conversational skills, good conversation essentials are an ongoing learning process. So now I want to hear from you. For this week's discussion board assignment, you can answer all of the questions. You can pick 1 or 2 to hone in on. It's entirely up to you. One question you might answer is, what communication barriers do you need to overcome? So going back to that list of communication barriers in people skills, which ones right now are the most challenging for you and which ones do you need to work on? You might answer, what conversation essentials are your strengths? And that's going back to the 5 positives of good communication. And the reason for this question isn't to brag or to toot your own horn, but it's to gain self-awareness, know which areas you're good at so that you can build on those strengths in the future. Because research into strengths says that people really excel when they find their strengths and then hone in on them and use them often. And then on a similar note is the question, which conversation essentials you need to work on? And again, that's important to gain that self-awareness, know which areas you don't excel at as often, and then to be able to bring some of those up. So I'm excited to hear from you and this week's discussion board. Just as a reminder, Monday through Wednesday are set aside for your initial posts, and then you're going to come back Thursday through Sunday and respond to your peers. I look forward to hearing more in this week's discussion board assignment.